Have you ever had a moment when someone's cruel words actually pushed you to make a life-changing decision? I was 28 years old, working as a substitute teacher, and barely making enough to cover rent. I'd always dreamed of being a writer, but never had the courage to actually try. I kept telling myself I'd do it someday when I had more time or money or confidence. Then I went to my high school reunion. I ran into my old English teacher, Mr. Patterson. He was the one person who'd always encouraged my writing back in school. I was excited to tell him I was teaching now, thinking he'd be proud. Instead, he looked disappointed. He asked if I was still writing, and I said no, not really, just some journal entries here and there. He nodded slowly and said, "That's a shame. I always thought you had real talent." Guess I was wrong. Those words hit me like a truck. I tried to laugh it off, said life got in the way, bills to pay, you know how it is. He just shrugged and said, "Everyone has bills. The difference is some people make excuses, and some people make it happen." Then he walked away. I stood there feeling like I'd been slapped. Part of me was angry. Who was he to judge my life? But the other part of me knew he was right. I'd been hiding behind excuses for 10 years. That night, I went home and couldn't sleep. His words kept replaying in my head. I pulled out an old notebook where I'd started a novel in college. I read the first few chapters and realized it wasn't terrible. It needed work, but the bones were there. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to finish that book no matter what. I started waking up at 5 a.m. before work to write. I cut out Netflix, social media, everything that wasted time. I wrote on weekends, on lunch break, any spare moment I had. 6 months later, I finished the first draft. It was rough, but it was done. I spent another 3 months revising, then hired an editor with money I'd saved from skipping coffee runs and eating cheaper meals. I queried literary agents for a year, got 47 rejections. Each one hurt, but I kept going. Then agent number 48 said yes. A year after that, my book sold to a publisher. Not for a huge amount, but enough to prove Mr. Patterson wrong, or maybe to prove him right. The book came out 2 years after that reunion. It didn't become a bestseller, but it did well enough that I could quit substitute teaching and write full-time. I sent a copy to Mr. Patterson with a note that said, "Thank you for the push I needed." He wrote back a month later. His letter said he remembered our conversation and that he'd been harsh on purpose. He said he could see I was stuck, and sometimes people need a wake-up call more than they need encouragement. He said he'd been gambling, that I'd either prove him wrong or prove myself right. He apologized if he'd hurt, but he was glad it worked. I framed that letter. Last year, my third book hit the New York Times bestseller list. I did an interview where they asked me what inspired me to become a writer. I told them about Mr. Patterson and how his cruel words were actually the kindest thing anyone ever did for me. He called me after the interview aired. He was crying. He said he'd been carrying guilt for years, worried he'd crushed my dreams instead of igniting them. I told him he gave me the greatest gift anyone can give, belief disguised as a challenge. Sometimes the people who hurt us are actually the ones who save us. They just do it in a way we don't recognize until later. Mr. Patterson didn't coddle me. He didn't tell me it was okay to give up on my dreams. He made me angry enough to fight for them, and that made all the difference.